In Elden Ring, there are an astonishing 308 weapons spread across 32 different categories, and only 9 of these weapons can be crowned as the legendary weapons. Because these 9 weapons hold such a high status, I wanted to work out which one was the best, by playing through the entire game 9 separate times, once with each of the weapons, to truly work out which one was the best legendary weapon. Before we get into the countdown, I'd like to talk about how the runs were structured. Every run started with the Wretch class. I then gave myself the weapon, the minimum requirements to use the weapon, and then took it from there. All of the runs took roughly the same route, by leveling the weapons to +2, killing Margit and Godric, leveling the weapons to +5, then killing Radahn and the Tree Sentinel, level the weapons to +9 and kill everything up to and including the god skins, then level the weapon to +10 and finish the game. Along the way, I would grab buffs and talismans that would accommodate the weapon that I was currently using. Now that you know what is going on, let's get into the list. Coming in at number 9 is the Golden Order Greatsword. This may come as a surprise to some of you, and to be honest, it was for me as well. Before I started the run, I thought, it's a greatsword, surely its damage is not half bad. And I wasn't wrong. Its damage is really good. Margit, Godric, Radahn, Tree Sentinel, even Godfrey and Morgott, and this weapon really shined during Fire Giant's fight, where the single largest number out of all 9 runs appeared on screen at a staggering 8,200 damage after I casted the skill of this weapon, Establish Order, which does amazing damage, except it is very difficult to get the entire cast off, and deals exclusively holy damage on the initial explosion, and if you're not close enough to make the follow-up swings hit, the projectile also deals only holy damage. Continuing on from Fire Giant, the Godskins went smoothly, and then Malekith. The first colossal test for the weapon that does primarily holy damage against a boss that is 80% resistant to holy. Luckily the fight did go well, since I'm well accustomed to his moveset, but the charge attack from this weapon did 586 damage, which is roughly 70% more damage than the charge attack I was doing to Margit. This may sound like a lot, but I only had 3 buffs active and was using a +2 weapon. In Malekith's fight, I had 7 buffs active, a +10 weapon, and had over double the faith. Moving on, Gideon went as smooth as Gideon fight can go. Godfrey would have been fine, but I really wanted to get the skill off, and then Radagon and Elden Beast. This fight alone took 30 minutes of attempts, and luckily the first time I got to Elden Beast, I managed to kill him. To counteract that negativity, this weapon requires 28 faith, which means I could use Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow without needing to upgrade faith at all. Overall, this weapon is really good, especially against things like Deathbirds, since not only are they weak against holy, but this weapon also does 20% more damage to undead enemies. But because most of the late game bosses are very resistant to holy, and you wouldn't even get this weapon till late game considering it is dropped from the Misbegotten Crusader, who wields the weapon in the Consecrated Snowfield after nearly all the bosses in the game which this weapon is actually good against, so it unfortunately ends up in last place on the list. At number 8, to probably no one's surprise, is the Eclipse Hotel. Before I started with all the runs, I thought this weapon would surely be dead last. Considering it has a 50-50 split between physical and holy damage, and since it's a curved sword, its moveset isn't great when you only have one of them. And I wasn't wrong. This weapon ended up taking the longest to beat the game, only 3 minutes longer than the Golden Order Greatsword. Its damage is also the same story as the Golden Order Greatsword. Everything is fine up until Malekith. Or so I thought, until I started to fight the Godskins, where I realised this weapon didn't pass the DPS check after sleeping them. The stance damage from this weapon is also so small that it ended up killing most things before even staggering them if I wasn't concentrated on charge attacks. And to add insult to injury, this weapon's reach distance is tiny, so most fights were up close and personal. So I seem to have only talked about negatives here. Why does this weapon rank higher than the Golden Order Greatsword? Well, it is the fastest attacking weapon out of all the weapons on the list. So not only is it easy to get off a lot of attacks at once, but during a boss's combo moveset I could still get hits in. This weapon's skill also buffs the weapon with holy damage and deathblight buildup, but that's kind of useless since I worked out during the run that not a single NPC, enemy or boss can be deathblighted, but where the weapon really shines is probably in PvP. I didn't test this directly, but not only does this weapon do deathblight buildup, but 40% of the damage dealt is completely ignored by shields, no matter what shield you're using. But back to the run. Same as the Golden Order Greatsword, since the weapon has such a high faith requirement, I could use both Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, but I never ended up using the latter. On to Radabeast. These two were a huge issue. The damage against them, even on the strongest attacks, was abysmal. The whole fight ended up taking nearly 6 minutes and was the single longest fight out of all 9 runs, so yeah, that's why this weapon ends up ranking at 8th. Before we move on to the rest of the list, I'd like to state that this list isn't evenly spread between all weapons. The 2 weapons I just covered are very low on the list, so if you want to use a legendary weapon, don't use those 2. If you really want to challenge yourself though, use those 2. At number 7, we finally get to stray away from holy damage with the Devourer's Scepter. This Great Hammer can be acquired earlier than any other legendary weapon, taken only about 5 minutes after you start a new save, also giving you one of the best armor sets in the game at the same time, which I ended up using in every single run you see in this video. But we're not here for the armor, we're here for the weapon, which is a very interesting weapon. To start off, let's cut to the chase. I used the skill on this weapon a total of 1 time throughout the entire run. If you're looking to do damage with this skill, you won't find it. Even with several buffs, this skill does about half the damage of a normal attack. Although this skill does heal you, it's not by much. But it heals more depending on how many enemies are within the hit radius, which I think is one of the reasons why Banal specifically has this weapon when he assists you in the Godskin duo fight. Apart from this skill, the Devourer Scepter is a pretty standard Great Hammer, a great moveset with enough stance damage to stagger just about anything in the game in a few hits. Its added fire damage is very nice against certain bosses such as Radagon or the Erdtree avatars, which I did kill on the run to get the Flame Shrouding cracked here to boost my fire damage by an additional 20%, on top of Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow, which I could use since this weapon also has a 25 faith requirement. On top of those buffs, I also used the Axe Talisman, Radagon Sword Seal, Ritual Sword Talisman, and the Spiked Cracked Tear to buff my damage, which are all 4 very easy to get buffs. To be honest, this weapon is the most middle ground weapon. The skill isn't all that good unless you're low on health or in a crowd of weaker enemies, and the damage output and scaling from the weapon itself is above any normal hammer with the Flame Art achievement applied to it, which is why I believe it sits comfortably in 7th place. At number 6, we have the Ruin's Greatsword. The first, but not the last colossal sword on this list. This weapon is found after beating the Misbegotten Warrior and Crucible Knight duo in Redmane Castle, either before or after the Radahn Festival. Which, now that I think about it, is strange that this is the second legendary weapon that drops from a Misbegotten. It's got the standard moveset of a colossal sword, but its charge attack has a special follow-up attack, where rocks fly up out of the ground dealing gravity magic damage, which means that this weapon also deals extra damage to gravity enemies such as Astel or the Falling Star Beasts. A downside of this charge attack is that the stance damage of the initial hit has been reduced, but makes up for it with the rocks. Which may not sound like such a bad thing, but when you hit a charge attack and then the enemy you're fighting moves out of the way, the stance damage is not as much as what it should be. Unlike the Devourer Scepter though, the skill of this weapon is where it really shines. Wave of Destruction. Like the charge attack of this weapon, it creates rocks that come out of the ground, but this time in a massive line in front of you. This skill it's just fun. It's so much fun to see a giant wave of rocks fly towards your enemy, and the damage from it is great. It also deals a fair amount of stance damage. To top it off, if you're close enough for the weapon to hit the enemy, it hits twice. Once from the sword, and once from the rocks. I buffed myself with the Warrior Jar Shard, Axe Talisman, and Radagon Soul Seal, although the latter was mainly for health and stamina since this is the heaviest weapon on the list, and the 3rd heaviest weapon in the entire game. I don't really have much else to say about this weapon, so here, enjoy the Ruin's Greatsword. 5th place goes to the Bolt of Grandsax. This spear is probably everyone's favourite lightning weapon due to its absolutely insane skill, Ancient Lightning Spear. But I'll get to this skill in a second. The Bolt of Grandsax can be found on the Bolt of Grandsax in Leyndell. And because it is located in Leyndell, this does mean it is one of the few weapons in the game that disappears once Malekith is killed and the city is buried in ash. But let's talk about the actual performance of this weapon. And it is amazing. First of all, because it is a spear and not a great spear, its attack speed is surprisingly fast, which I found out to be way better to deal damage rather than using charge attacks. Pair this with its long reach and it seriously chewed through every single boss. The only downside is attacking after rolling doesn't have nearly as much reach, meaning I have to be close to someone for it to hit. But let's talk about the thing that really matters with this weapon, its skill. Not only is it a chargeable skill, so things like the Godfrey Icon and Warrior Jar Shard could boost its damage, but I was able to start every single fight I did before the boss even made it to me because of the range of this skill. I did Morgoth's entire fight without doing any physical damage since I could just stand back and keep casting. Fire Giant's ankle was broken in a single cast, and follow-up casts of the skill would deal 4,500 damage to him. I could also launch at his eye in phase 2 even though he wasn't lying on the ground. The Godskins, Malekith, Gideon, even Godfrey all had amazing finishes to the fight because of this skill. Radagon, well, he does what he normally does with range attacks. But when his guard is down, I could still get it off, and to end it off, I probably got the best finish to a run with this weapon, by sniping Elden Beast out of the air. If that all doesn't still sound good enough, this weapon also deals 20% more damage to dragons, and 10% more damage to ancient dragons. One of the only downsides to this weapon is it has the second highest dexterity requirement in the game, but apart from that, this weapon is so much fun because of all the possibilities the skill opens up. Finally, into the top half of the list. At number 4, the Grafted Blade Greatsword. This weapon was probably the most surprising for me. That also probably has something to do with the fact that I had no clue what the skill did until halfway through the run.
So it raises every attribute, including my stats. I didn't know that.
The skill in question, Oath of Vengeance, which raises all attributes by 5 for 1 minute. Yes, this weapon's skill, at the cost of just 20 FP, is the same as using Godric's Great Rune, which for a run where I was mainly leveling just strength and dexterity for more damage is a godsend to have a bit more health and stamina. To get this weapon, you need to kill the Leonine Misbegotten in Castle Morn. Yes, if you are keeping count, that is the 3rd legendary weapon that you get from a Misbegotten warrior. If there is a lore reason as to why these guides hold 3 of the 9 legendary weapons, I would love to know. Anyways, because the skill only buffs a player and isn't a direct weapon buff or attack, let's talk about the weapon itself. This is the most Unga Bunga weapon out of all the legendaries, scaling primarily with strength, and is also the only weapon to deal purely physical damage, and only needs 27 strength if you use it two-handed, making this one of the best weapons in the game to do an RL1 run, even though it requires 40 strength. The Grafted Blade Greatsword isn't exactly the fanciest weapon of the legendaries, so I can't really say much more, but what I can say is it deals blunt force trauma, and it does it better than any other weapon on the list. In 3rd place, with a bronze medal, is the Sword of Night and Flame. I'll start this one off by quoting what a viewer said in chat during this run. It's like a sharp staff, which I think perfectly describes the weapon. You get this weapon from Karia Manor, and it requires 4 separate stats: Strength, Dex, Intelligence, and Faith. Because this weapon's damage is split between physical, magic, and fire, its damage from boss to boss varies so much when using melee attacks, and overall is never really amazing. But the skill is why you use this weapon, Night and Flame Stance, which actually has 2 attacks as the name of the sword and skill might suggest. When casting the skill, you can either do a light attack to cast Comet Azure, or a charge attack to cast a Wave of Flames, which scale directly off of Int and Faith respectively. Both of these attacks deal mammoth amounts of damage and have a massive 40 poise damage. The Flame attack is especially useful for crowd clearing because of its very wide hitbox. To add to this, if you're close enough to your target while casting this, the sword itself still has a hitbox, dealing a little bit more damage. Another massive plus is its 24 faith requirement, meaning I could use Flame Grant Me Strength from the start, and I only needed 1 more level to use Golden Vow. Flame Grant Me Strength is probably the biggest buff you can give this weapon, not only boosting the melee damage by 20%, but also boosting the flame damage from the skill by 20%. Other buffs I had for this weapon were the Warrior Jar Shard to boost the weapon's skill by 10%, the Ritual Sword Talisman to boost overall damage by 10%, and the Magic and Flame Shrouding Crack tiers to boost both parts of the skill by 20%. It was also a breeze getting those tiers, since Erdtree avatars are so weak to fire. The skill also gave me probably one of the best finishes to Godfrey's fight out of all the fights I did. The best method I ended up finding for this weapon was to stagger a boss with the melee attacks, and then use the skill to do the main damage. And for Radagon, well, I didn't even have to stagger him. I started off the fight with a single cast of the flame attack, which ended up dealing an eye-watering 4,100 damage, taking him immediately to phase 2. This weapon was a very easy 3rd place for me, but it still doesn't even compare to the top 2. The next 2 weapons were probably the hardest decision out of all the weapons. If I could, I would place them in a tie for so many different reasons, but I chose not to. So, coming in a very close 2nd place...
You were at my side all along, my true mentor, my guiding moonlight.
The Dark Moon Greatsword. There is a lot to talk about with this weapon. To start off, for one of the big reasons as to why it's in 2nd place and not 1st, how to get it. This weapon is found at the end of Rani's questline, which involves killing Radahn, Loretta, Mimiktir, Renala, and Astel. For some people, it's quite a hassle to be going back and forth over and over. This wasn't a problem for me, obviously, since I just gave myself the weapon at the beginning, but this is definitely something to take into account before trying to get it. A nice thing about the weapon is that it's very easy to buff. I ended up using the Axe Talisman, the Godfrey icon to boost the projectile you get when you enchant the weapon with its skill, Moonlight Greatsword, the Ritual Sword Talisman to boost damage by 10%, and the Warrior Jar Shard, which boosts the projectile's damage by a further 10%. I also used the Spiked Crack tier and Magic Shrouding Crack tier in the Physic, and Flame Grant Me Strength and Gold Vow. All this combined created the hardest hitting hits in the entire run, consistently no matter which boss I was fighting.
Oh!
But only when the sword is enchanted by the skill. The sword by itself really isn't that great, but with this skill it changes everything. After doing some testing, I worked out that the skill adds 35 frost build to every attack, plus the projectile does 82 frost build up. So if you do a charge attack and both the projectile and the blade hits, you do 172 frost build up. The added frostbite also means that when something is frosted, this weapon will do 20% more damage. This projectile also deals 35 stance damage, meaning you can break the stance of any enemy in the game with ease. Because of the high frost buildup, the high stance damage, this allowed me to constantly pull astronomical amounts of damage, pretty easily reaching the 3,000 to 4,000 damage mark many times, and even reaching 7,000 damage in a single hit on Fire Giant, which also ended up being the easiest Fire Giant fight out of all 9 weapons. It also absolutely plowed its way through the Godskins, Malekith, Gideon, Godfrey, and even Radagon, who was killed in 6 hits plus the riposte. It even demolished the Erdtree Avatar and Dragon Barrow, while I only had a +2 with no buffs. Everyone, this is the Dark Moon Greatsword.
And finally, the best legendary weapon in the game. At the number 1 spot, the Mariah's Executioner Sword. This weapon consistently did more damage than any other legendary weapon, and it did so much damage that it ended up one-shotting 2 of the bosses. Kinda. In the Godskin Joy fight, it did one-shot Skinny, and it nearly one-shot Fatty, but they still technically have the whole health bar. The other boss? Gideon. Yep, it was the most satisfying thing I have probably ever done, and I would do it a million more times. Once again, like the Dark Moon Greatsword, this damage is only possible due to the skill. I know that this weapon's skill isn't what people were hoping for, considering it comes from this guy, who has this moveset, but in my eyes, we got something even better, because this skill counts as successive attacks. If you know Elden Ring, you've probably seen those words before. Millicent's Prosthesis, Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, and the Thorny Cracked Tear all buff damage with successive attacks. The only problem with this is that you can't get the 2 best talismans in a single run. Millicent's Prosthesis you acquire from killing Millicent throughout her questline, and the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia is from completing her questline. So I just got the weaker version, the Winged Sword Insignia from the Clean Rot Knight in Leonia, and Millicent's Prosthesis after she handed it to me gently. This weapon also does magic damage, even though it doesn't scale with intelligence, so it can be buffed with Magic Shroud and Cracked Tear, and if you wanted, Terra Magica. Pair this with the Warrior Jar Shard, Ritual Sword Talisman, and you pretty much break the game. I can't really say much more about how insane this weapon is, so everyone, I present to you the best legendary weapon in the game, the Mariah's Executioner Sword. I'd just like to add as well with this weapon that after a bit of testing, this weapon, when given the maximum strength, dex, and arcane, can actually 2-shot Godfrey, Radagon, and Elden Beast. Anyways, I really hope you all enjoyed the video, because this is probably honestly one of the most fun times I've had making a video. Being able to use the most OP weapons rather than challenge myself like I have in every other videos was really refreshing. So if you want to see more videos like this one, do let me know. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video so you don't miss out on future videos, and thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all later.